so up until now, I've provided you with a couple of videos. So those two videos were sort of giving you an overview in more detail than you should be familiar with at this point, but of what cellular respiration is and glycolysis, and all the steps that are going to be involved. So those two videos might seem a little overwhelming when you watch them, but I did try to stress that they were mostly just to give you sort of a snapshot of the unit and what we're about to learn. And so everything you saw in that video, we're going to go through in a lot more detail with me explaining it. So hopefully it's going to make a little bit more sense than what you saw. And I want you to use those two videos as well to refer back to as we progress through the unit, because this is a lot of information coming at you, really new probably information. And if you keep going back to those two initial videos that I gave you, it's going to give you ideas of how those topics are all connected and how these cycles that we're going to talk about are connected. And so you're going to watch a video. This is a video link that I'm going to post in the content as well, but it's going to give you an idea overall of what cellular respiration is. Now, I told you in the beginning that cellular respiration is something that both plants and animals do. Okay, plants are the only ones that photosynthesize, but plants and animals undergo this process called cellular respiration. Okay, and it is more commonly referred when we talk about cellular respiration to humans and other animals because it's the main process that we use. And I left you guys with a few terms and definitions to go through and learn about, but I'm going to highlight some of them right now. So because these are terms you're going to see often. And first term I want to look at is the term aerobic. Anytime you see the word aerobic, it refers to oxygen. So when we talk about an aerobic organism, it's an organism that requires oxygen. So that would be us. If you put the letters AN in front of it, it means the opposite. So anytime you add the two letters AN in front of a word, it generally means the opposite of what the word is trying to say. So we know aerobic means oxygen. Anaerobic organisms do not need oxygen to survive. So there's some bacteria out there that actually survive without oxygen. And then there's two different main types of organisms, ones that can make their own food and ones that cannot and depend on others for food. So an autotroph, the only autotrophs here let's put an example here. Autotroph, these are plants. Heterotroph, everything else. So every other living organism is considered a heterotroph unless you are photosynthesizing, and it's plants that photosynthesize. Okay, and so auto just means that it makes its own food. Hetero means that it's depending on others for food. Okay, now here's what we're going to do with each cycle that we talk about. I'm going to give you the big picture of things first. Maybe let's just cover some things up as we go. So I want to give you an overview of what cellular respiration is. Basically, cellular respiration in both plants and animals, we're using the chemical energy of food molecules. So food, I know when we talk about food, we're talking about the actual items that we eat. So if it's a hamburger or a salad or some type of sandwich, that's what we consider our food. But if you remember back to Unit 1, each of those food items that we eat are made up of proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and that's what we talk about when we're talking about food. Okay, these molecules are released and partially captured in the form of ATP. So this is really just a general description for what cellular respiration is. We're using our food energy and we're releasing we're breaking it down, we're releasing it into our bloodstream, and it's going to go through a process called cellular respiration, and we're going to capture some energy in the form of ATP. Remember this important molecule I talked to you about. So here is this diagram I'm going to keep coming back to. So when we talk about cellular respiration, a lot of people just think it's in animals. Okay, it is in animals, but it also occurs in plants. And the location of where it occurs is the same for both plants and animals. So if you recall that this is, I gave you guys a diagram to label what the mitochondria looks like and the special areas and compartments that mitochondria have. So both animal cells and plant cells have mitochondria. this is where this process that we're about to talk about mostly takes place. And when I say mostly, because we're going to look at a series of events that happen. And the first event, so this is just a real general picture of what happens, but the first event actually happens in the cytoplasm. So this fancy word here, cytosol, is just another word for cytoplasm. So the first event of cellular respiration takes place in the cytoplasm. So we take our organic molecules, so this is our food, and it goes through the first event. We get some ATP out of it. Then it goes into the mitochondria, and the other processes that we're going to talk about actually happen inside the mitochondria. And really, the process is to make more energy through ATP, and because of the processes it's going through, the byproducts, or what we get out of it in addition to our ATP, is carbon dioxide and water. So this kind of represents an overview of where we're headed. So we've got one process that happens in the cytoplasm, then it heads inside the mitochondria for two other processes. Here's our final products: CO2, carbon dioxide, H2O, water, and ATP. And ATP comes along through each of the processes. Okay, so that's sort of an overview of the big term cellular respiration. Here's something important, that carbohydrates, fats, and proteins can all be used from our food as fuels, but glucose is the most common. Okay, glucose is really generally what eventually makes its way into this whole process. Okay, and remember that glucose is just a simple sugar from carbohydrates. So carbohydrates is one of the most common, easiest way to get glucose, or eating simple sugars. However, fats and proteins, if you recall, remember that a lot of these biomolecules are made up of the same elements. So it wouldn't be hard to convert some of these fats and proteins into glucose as well. So generally, all I want you to think about for this is that this is the most common. So this is important here. Although others can be used, it's the most common for sure. Okay, so I gave you an idea of what it looks like, overview, but let's get a little bit more specific. Now we're going to just zoom in a little bit closer to what's happening in this photo. Remember I said that one of the first processes that happens occurs in the cytoplasm. So before we're inside of a cell, okay? We're inside of an animal cell or a plant cell. Floating around in the cytoplasm is where this process happens. So we've just extracted some glucose from our food, okay? First place it's going to go is into a process called glycolysis. So this has to happen first. Glycolysis is a whole set of steps in itself, which we're going to deal with in a minute, but I just want to give you that overview so you kind of understand what's happening. We put glucose through a process called glycolysis. We get some ATP out of it. Glycolysis produces a product of some sort that then heads in, right here, I didn't want to jump ahead, but it's here. It's called acetyl-CoA. For now, it's just a product of glycolysis is all you need to know. That product of glycolysis heads inside of the mitochondria to undergo two more cycles. So second is called Krebs cycle. Third is called the electron transport chain. You don't need to know any more than that right now. All you need to know is that cellular respiration, it includes 3 main cycles, and through each cycle, we're trying to get as much ATP as possible out of each cycle. And in the end products, we end up with some carbon dioxide, we end up with some water, and we actually end up with some oxygen coming out of here as well. And so the remainder of this unit, it's not a very long unit, but it's a very involved unit. It's going to take a lot of your time focusing on the processes. I find that students find this a little bit difficult because it is very chemistry based. We're looking at molecules and reactions really for this whole unit. So overview of cellular respiration, 3 main stages, I guess you could say, and through each stage the goal is we want to get as much ATP out of it as possible. So here we go, overall goals of respiration. To break bonds between 6 carbon atoms. This is, let's put it in here so you know why this is here. Remember, glucose is the most common item to enter glycolysis. So the 6 carbon atoms that we're starting with are mostly from glucose, or almost always from glucose. So we want to break the bonds of glucose. Remember, glucose is made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And eventually we want to make carbon dioxide. And so think about 6 carbon dioxides would need 6 carbons. And so we're starting with glucose, we're breaking it down in a series of reactions to eventually get some carbon dioxide. Goal number 2, hydrogen is also a part of glucose. So we want to move hydrogen atom electrons, so just the electron portion of a hydrogen, from glucose over to oxygen. And that process actually makes us some water molecules. Okay, so these, again, remember, these 3 goals are summing up the entire goal of the whole unit that we're about to cover. Okay, so these are the overall big goals of every process put together. So when we're starting with glucose and we end up with our final products, these are the things that are happening. And the final goal is to trap as much free energy released in the process in the form of ATP. Okay, so that's sort of an overview of cellular respiration. And it gives you sort of a snapshot again of where we're headed, but where we're headed is actually to look at each stage in a lot of detail. And so what I want to show you now, before we deal with each stage individually, I want to show you again in just a tiny bit more detail, just baby steps here, of what those stages look like. So stage 1, we call glycolysis. This is the process that happens in the cytoplasm. So inside the cell, but not yet inside of the mitochondria. Glycolysis products, one of the products is a product called acetyl-CoA. It moves inside of the mitochondria so that it can enter the stage. These are actually broken down into 2 stages. Once the acetyl-CoA is produced, we call that actually stage 2, which I'll reinforce that when we get to it. But glycolysis makes something called pyruvate, and it's not pyruvate that enters the mitochondria. It's actually gets converted before it heads in, which is why we have stage 2. You'll see when we go through that. So it can actually be broken down into 4 main stages, this one being a really, really small one. And so often, sometimes you'll see that people will consider it, no, it's just 3 main stages, but this, in some textbooks, they'll consider to be a stage in itself as well. And so once acetyl-CoA goes inside of the mitochondria, it's going to enter stage 3, which we call the Krebs cycle. Okay. Again, this is a series of reactions that we'll cover in detail, but the goal here is then to make some ATP. And our products, a couple of them from here, end up heading over to stage 4, which is called the electron transport chain. We're going to get some more ATP, some water, and that sort of sums up cellular respiration as a whole.